Welcome back to the next of the videos for OCR A-Level History, Britain, Module 1930 through to 1997. This one is continuing with Churchill and his eventual appointment as Prime Minister. So coming out of the wilderness years. First of all, we're going to look at Chamberlain and the decline of Chamberlain, fall of Chamberlain, his resignation, etc. One of the biggest problems that Chamberlain has was the idea of appeasement, and that it obviously didn't work, and that he demonstrated a lot of the characteristics, etc., that weren't really wanted in the prime minister of a country that was at war, or certainly we're going to get into a more active war. He also lacked support from the Labour Party and Attlee as well. So obviously there was calls for coalitions, national coalitions, etc. And Attlee certainly didn't want to be part of this, with Chamberlain being at the helm. Attlee was not a big fan of Chamberlain, and also Attlee believed that Chamberlain wasn't particularly a fan of the Labour Party, being quoted as saying that he had always treated us like dirt. So you're not really going to go into some sort of coalition or agreement, certainly, with someone like that. Chamberlain also appointed Churchill to the Admiralty as well, which maybe was a shrewd move for Chamberlain, but also it could have been something that actually led to his downfall, and also led to Churchill's ultimate being offered the position of Prime Minister, because it helped demonstrate a bit further that he was involved in this war and he was willing to get stuff done, which is maybe what was needed at the time. Obviously, there's loads of evidence to suggest that he wasn't cut out to be a wartime leader at all. So first of all, his character, very uninspiring, lacked energy, lacked vision. Certainly didn't seem to be someone who was cut out for a war. He made all attempts to appease. Some say that he gave in, and he rolled over to Hitler during the Munich conference and the agreement over Czechoslovakia. And now that we were at war, a lot of people were thinking that this wasn't someone who was going to be able to lead us during this war. Chamberlain himself also acknowledged that he probably wasn't the right person for this. In a letter that he sent to his sister, he basically said how he loathed this war. "I was never meant to be a war minister." That's not really something that's going to inspire you as an individual or a nation either. Some of the decisions that he made obviously weren't great. So first of all, the Munich conference, going against a lot of advice from some. Fair play, he did actually have a lot of people who were, we want a peaceful resolution rather than go to war. But there's also evidence to suggest that he kind of underestimated Hitler, and he was heard saying that Hitler had missed the bus and that he had missed his opportunity. And days later, he basically extended his invasions to Scandinavian countries. So his foresight wasn't exactly great. And coupled to this, the economy as well. Britain was on its knees. Rationing had been introduced in 1940, and the country basically couldn't see a way out of this economically and were really struggling. So all of these things conspired really to go against Chamberlain and against his want, etc. He was to resign. There were two main candidates to take over from Chamberlain: Lord Halifax and Winston Churchill. Lord Halifax was Foreign Secretary. He was seen as someone who was very much an appeaser, and that he was probably the best person to try to negotiate with the Germans. Now, obviously, at this time, Germany didn't really look as though they were in any way wanting to negotiate. So that would obviously go against him. He was a member of Lords, not the Commons. So again, evidence to go against his appointment would be that maybe he wasn't as hands-on as he could be, and that he wasn't the right person to become Prime Minister if he wasn't even part of the House of Commons. And there were also major doubts about his self-belief and his motivation, that he wasn't the right person. And by putting Lord Halifax in, you were getting another Chamberlain, basically. On the other hand, you've got Winston Churchill. Now, the King wasn't really keen on Churchill and had to be persuaded ironically by Chamberlain, to really give him the job. He'd been out of office for several years. He was very seen as an outcast within his own party, certainly within wider government, and certainly within the wider public as well. Evidence, obviously, just that we looked at in previous videos over India, appeasement, abdication, etc. He was appointed to the Admiralty. He oversaw a series of victories as well as a series of, let's call them defeats, where, you could say that this limited success maybe isn't the right person for this. And obviously his historical war record in World War One, etc., wasn't really great. So if you look at evidence like Gallipoli and things like that, then maybe you could say, is this the right man to lead us? But two key things. He had been right about Hitler, and he was an anti-appeaser, and appeasement wasn't what we wanted at this time. And also, he was seen as a man of energy, confidence. He seemed as though he basically the antithesis of Chamberlain, the very opposite. He wasn't going to be someone who would roll over and just take it. And ultimately, he was appointed Prime Minister in the May of 1940. On the previous slide, it was saying it was like a destiny, and it seems as though Churchill believed it was a destiny. There's a nice little quote here from the book The Gathering Storm, in which he is talking about how this, like, he was put on earth to do this job, and that everything that he had been doing was being built up to this job, and it was inevitable that this would happen. Obviously, I'll let you read through that quote yourselves. He came into this job, though, and there was a bit of a problem, obviously. So war advancing very, very quickly in the summer months of 1940. Some of the issues that Churchill faced were that Britain stood alone. Remember, Churchill was really keen on this grand alliance with Russia, France, USA. But obviously, problems with that is that USSR, for instance, had signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, so why would they want to get involved? Isolationist stance that the USA had, and also the view that the US, the president had of Churchill was that he was quite aggressive, a bit gung-ho, and they weren't really wanting to get involved in something like this straight away. And obviously France had their own issues as well, in that they had been invaded, so they had their own problems. The invasion of France brought on another issue for Churchill, and this was the British Armed Forces who were in France being cut off from the rest of their troops, and the issues that would happen if, let's say, they were isolated. We're talking somewhere in the region of 300,000 people, French and British troops, who could basically be cut off by the Nazis if they were able to get through the north of France. We'll look in a little bit in that in a moment. Other issues that he was facing were economic issues. So obviously we've got rationing, we've got the cost of war. Britain's gold reserves were dwindling really fast because of the cost of war, and they would continue to dwindle throughout 1940. Added to this is obviously the issues and fears that Churchill have regarding the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal and access to the British Empire and resources that Britain would have throughout their empire. So this was another major issue economically. And the final thing that he really had to be concerned about was stuff that's going on at home, and that would be the fears that the British public had over their lives. So we've seen heavy bombing going on in Poland, and obviously the fall of France. Now these things have been done, the attention's going to be turned on to Britain, and Hitler was very keen to invade Britain. To be able to do this, he would have to use aerial support, and this would ultimately lead to the bombing of Britain. And the British public were really, really fearful, so Churchill had to deal with that as well. As well as these issues, there are some signs of victories or positives for Churchill in these early years, and these could be seen as early successes. And the first of which would be Dunkirk. So if we go back to the potential annexing of British and French armed forces in France following the fall of France, an Operation Dynamo was basically created to try to rescue and to retrieve these troops from Dunkirk in May 1940. There's around about 300,000 troops were rescued, British and French troops, using the British Navy destroyers, etc., but also what were known historically now as little ships, which are around about 850 to 1,000, depending on where you look. Statistics suggest somewhere in that region. Little fishermen trawlers, private boats, etc., used to ferry these troops from the northern coast of France back to Kent and Dover and places like that. And this lasted from around about the 26th of May through to the 4th of June. And like I say, around about 300,000 troops being rescued. And this was seen as a great positive and a successful Churchill that he was able to do this. The loss of these troops would have had a major impact on Britain, and I think it probably would have led to the eventual invasion by sea of Britain from the Germans. So this was a huge thing. The second thing would be the Battle of Britain. So knowing that a sea invasion wouldn't really work too well with the RAF, etc., defending the coast of Britain, the Germans with the Luftwaffe, they basically went on a campaign of trying to bomb Britain. And Hugh Dowding believed that the use of Hurricanes and Spitfires would be the best way of trying to deal with this. And the Battle of Britain, in August of 1940, was seen as, again, another major victory. They were able to withhold the Luftwaffe, the strength of the Luftwaffe, and this was seen as a really good decision by Churchill to keep the Hurricanes and the Spitfires in Britain to defend Britain. And this is seen as a defensive victory rather than an offensive victory, rather than send the Spitfires and Hurricanes elsewhere during this war. And the third and final one that we're going to look at is the Blitz. Now, the Blitz is a funny one because the killing of around about 33,000 people in the London southeast area of Britain doesn't really seem like a victory, but the victory comes from a moral victory and a morale victory as well. In the public eye, Churchill was seen as a strong leader. He gave strong, rousing speeches to keep the morale going. He talked about the Blitz spirit and how Britain are pulling together. And the morale was strong, and Hitler was counting on the fact that these bombing campaigns would really weaken the resolve of the British to the fact that Britain would be forced into surrendering and allow easy passage for the Nazis throughout the rest of Europe and possibly into Britain as well. This didn't work, and Churchill is seen as a contributing factor to that, and his morale and his speeches and his being visible on the streets as well, actually on the streets of London, showing his support for the people, that was seen as a big thing. It might only be a small thing, but it was actually had a big impact as well. So that was a quick run through of 1940 and Churchill becoming Prime Minister. In the next video, we will be looking a little bit more at his World War II record as Prime Minister, some of the interactions he had, positive and negative, with his own commanders and generals, etc. And then we'll move on to his relationships with other war leaders as well. Great. See you later. Bye.